Today I'll be speaking about an intriguing South Philadelphia native, one who lived an extremely crazy life. To say the very least, he instills fear into the Philly mob till this very day. So with no further delay, let's dive into the life of John Veasey. They called him John, and he was born and bred in the housing projects on 5th and Washington in South Philadelphia. By the age of 3, he learned how life, at times, could be unfair with the loss of his father, a longshoreman who was an alcoholic and abusive to his wife and kids. With the loss of his father, his older brother Billy took on the role of a father figure. At the time, his mother, a former barmaid, ran a family bakery on 9th Street in the Italian market in South Philly. She even moved her kids into an apartment above the bakery, and over time, Veasey began making deliveries for his mother on his bike. Some of those deliveries included drugs, like the meth that she was selling. Being around drugs led Veasey to using an assortment of them, such as meth, marijuana, angel dust, and heroin, which he began shooting by the age of 13. When he was 15, he had gotten 2 girls pregnant and also had his first arrest. It took place at his junior high school on April 7, 1981. He was arrested for assault and for brandishing a knife. That arrest was followed by another, again for assault, on March 26, 1983. 6 months later, on September 27, 1983, John Veasey's mother died of a heart attack. And on November 1st, 1983, he was placed in St. Gabriel's Home for Boys in Phoenixville as a result of the school assault, and he remained there until September 1984. Losing his mother sent him into a further downward spiral. Aside from the other drugs, he began using cocaine and developed a serious addiction, which fueled his appetite for violence. One of the more positive outlets that John Veasey used to release his anger was through boxing. He was fighting at the gym 3 times a day, and over time racked up over 1,500 fights. On the streets of South Philly, he was known to be very good with his hands. In order to support his drug habit, he began committing robberies, mostly of neighborhood drug dealers. In March of 1985, Veasey received a year probation for stealing a car, and later that same month, he pled guilty to a robbery case and was sentenced to 11 months, but only wound up doing 9 months out of that. Following his release, he was caught carrying a gun, and on December 5th, 1985, he luckily only received 2 additional years on probation. By the age of 24, Veasey, who by that time had been to court on 24 separate occasions for various crimes, including car theft, drug possession, and assault, had over 60 arrests under his belt. On March 12, 1991, he beat a guy to death, but somehow again lucked out. The victim was a known drug addict, and his death was ruled as an overdose. During that same year, Veasey would be sentenced to 2 years for an assortment of crimes, and it was during his incarceration that he managed to kick his drug habit. It's important to note his release in March of 1993 coincided with a perilous time in South Philadelphia. In and around early 1991, John Stanford was officially appointed as boss of the Philadelphia crime family, an appointment that was not warmly welcomed or accepted by the young South Philadelphia natives, most of whose fathers were members when Nicky Scarfer was the boss. This young home team faction was full of entitlement and felt that Stanford had no rightful claim to run South Philly. The crew of young guys were led by Michael Ciancaglini and Joey Molino. But according to Veasey, the power in that crew lied with Michael Ciancaglini, and Molino was known to depend on him. The Ciancaglini-Molino faction carried out the first preemptive strike on January 29, 1992. Felix Bocchino, an old-time member of the Philly mob, was found shot 2 times in the head and neck in his 1977 Buick. According to the testimony of Ralph Natale, who Molino advocated for to become the boss of Philly, it was Stevie Mazzone, a member of the Ciancaglini-Molino faction, who fired the shots into Bocchino, a charge Mazzone was ultimately acquitted for. Stanford retaliated for the Bocchino hit by sending guys to kill Michael Ciancaglini at his house, but he survived the ambush and was unharmed. Ciancaglini's brother, Joseph, happened to be Stanford's underboss, which in itself is crazy that brothers were on opposing sides. Following the failed attempt on Ciancaglini, Stanford tried using diplomacy by inducting both Ciancaglini and Molino into the family. which turned out not to be a wise decision, as the Ciancaglini-Molino faction struck once again. This time, their target would be Ciancaglini's brother, Joseph. In the early morning of March 2nd, 1993, at 5:58 a.m., four shooters wearing ski masks got out of a station wagon and entered the Warfield Breakfast and Lunch Express, and subsequently shot Joseph Ciancaglini 3 times in the face, left foot, and right shoulder. The recording came from a mounted FBI surveillance camera, which was on a pole across the street. Gaetano Scafidi, who was a shooter that day, would later testify that the order to hit Joseph Ciancaglini came from Michael Ciancaglini and Molino. He also identified the other shooters with him that day as Molino, George Borghese, and Stevie Mazzone. Miraculously, Joseph Ciancaglini survived the shooting, but was naturally out of commission. In turn, Stanford reassigned the underboss position to Frank Martins. Martins befriended Veasey while they both worked construction for a company owned by Stanford's brother-in-law. And they had one thing in common, a dislike for Joey Molino. Supposedly, in their younger years, Veasey took a go-kart from Molino, and while locked up with him in prison, he took a pair of sneakers off of him as well. As far as Martins was concerned, Veasey was the perfect guy to recruit to help with the Stanford faction's ongoing clash with Ciancaglini and Molino. So one day after work, he took Veasey to meet John Stanford. And with the nod from Stanford, Veasey became part of the team of guys who were on the hunt for the opposing faction. According to Veasey, they would drive around South Philly with an arsenal of weapons and be on the lookout for anyone in the Ciancaglini-Molino faction. They even tried planting several bombs onto Molino's car, but luckily for Molino, they had wiring malfunctions. And on one occasion, the hit team was going to snipe Molino with a high-powered rifle, but he spotted them and drove away. The hit team got lucky on August 5th, 1993, after spotting Ciancaglini and Molino walking down the street. Veasey and Phil Coletti were driving past in a white Ford Taurus and opened fire on them. Ciancaglini was hit in the forearm and chest, and Molino was shot 3 times in the ass. Veasey would describe Molino that day, who he said recognized him, as running between cars, screaming for help, while Ciancaglini tried to get up but fell back to the ground. I remember an old-timer telling me, we know if a guy was running away by where he gets shot. Michael Ciancaglini died as a result of his injuries that day. Following the shooting, Molino went into hiding and began soliciting local black guys to kill Veasey. But according to Veasey, the whole thing was a joke. I knew everybody there. He couldn't get one black guy to shoot me. The following day, on August 6, 1993, Stanford, his son Joe, and a driver was driving in a Cadillac, passing the Walt Whitman Bridge toll booth, when a stolen van pulled alongside them, and gunshots rang out, spraying the Cadillac. One of the bullets hit Stanford's son in the face, but Stanford and the driver were unharmed. The son was taken to the hospital to treat his injury. Naturally, the shooting of his son had Stanford fuming, and he let it be known to shoot anyone associated with Molino on sight. On September 17, 1993, Veasey and Giuseppe Gallara spotted Frank Baldino, a close friend of Molino's, getting into his Cadillac in front of the Melrose Diner. It was believed that Baldino supplied the stolen van used for the bridge shooting. Both Veasey and Gallara walked over to Baldino's driver's window and shot him multiple times in the head and chest. Frank Martins was the getaway driver that day. As a reward for the Baldino hit, which had Stanford elated, Veasey was inducted by Stanford into the family. The ceremony took place at the Penn Towers Hotel in West Philadelphia. In a recorded conversation between Stanford and Anthony Tony Buck Piccolo, a former Philly acting boss, and at the time Stanford's consigliere, Stanford could be heard telling Piccolo his opinion of Molino and his crew. They have no shame. They know nothing. Money is like a curse. They got no brains either. Piccolo responded, no shame and no brains. Stanford replied, I was born and raised that way, and I'm going to die that way, but with the right people. Over here, it's like kindergarten. John Veasey's life would change on December 30th, 1993. He was meeting his brother and a lawyer, of all places, the Melrose Diner. His brother Billy was extremely concerned and worried about him. He felt he was either going to be killed or would go to prison for the rest of his life. He wanted him to turn himself in and was finally able to convince him to do just that. The lawyer reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and arrangements were made for Veasey to go in and talk with them. The FBI told Veasey that Stanford put a contract out on him. So he went to meet with him wearing a wire and question him about it, but obviously Stanford didn't admit to anything. On January 14, 1994, Frank Martins and Vincent Pagano lured Veasey to an apartment in the 1800 block of South 7th Street. The apartment was located above a butcher shop. When they got into the apartment, they all sat down, and Veasey noticed that the furniture was covered with plastic, but they told him not to be alarmed. It was for the painting. At one point, Martins excused himself to go to the bathroom. When he returned, he put a .22 to the back of Veasey's head, and before squeezing the trigger 3 times, he said, "Bye-bye, John John." Even with being shot 3 times, Veasey managed to jump up and question Martins for shooting him. Martins told him, "You're wearing a wire." When Veasey protested by lifting his shirt, Martins shot him again, this time in the chest. Veasey charged Martins, pinning him against the wall, and managed to grab the trigger and squeeze off the rest of the bullets in the gun. Pagano grabbed Veasey from behind, and Martins began pistol whipping him. But Veasey was still fighting for his life and throwing punches at Martins and connecting with his face. He then tried to jump out of a window, but they managed to pull him away from it. He was tussling with both men, and a knife that Martins had fell to the ground. Veasey managed to grab it and stab Martins in the face with it. Pagano yelled out, "You're going to be in so much trouble. You just stabbed the underboss." Let me just add, I find that statement very comical. Here they are trying to kill the guy, just shot him up. Did they really think he cared at that point who he stabbed? Adding insult to injury, at one point, Pagano blurted out, "Let's all go to the hospital and say some black guys jumped us." Veasey told them, "I'm not going anywhere with you people." Pagano eventually opened the door and let Veasey out. After all, they were out of bullets, and Veasey possessed the only weapon, although for some reason he stuck it in the couch before leaving. He was rushed to a hospital where he told the police that Frank Martins shot him. At the time, supposedly, Veasey was elevated to a captain's position, but somehow Stanford and his guys found out that he'd been cooperating. Veasey described Stanford as follows. There were 2 John Stanfords. There was the one that portrayed the family guy, and then there was the one that was ruthless and didn't care about nobody. The following morning after his surgery, to remove bullets from his head and chest, Veasey was doing one-handed push-ups on the hospital room floor. What ultimately saved him was a layer of calcium deposits that formed on his skull from years of being hit in the head. Upon his release from the hospital, he went straight to jail and still faced murder charges from Michael Ciancaglini and Frank Baldino. In the meantime, the AUSA prepped him to be a witness against John Stanford. On May 18, 1994, John Stanford and 23 others were arrested on racketeering charges. At 6:45 a.m. on October 6, 1994, the same day John Veasey was scheduled to testify at Stanford's trial, Billy Veasey left his house in his purple GMC Jeep. He was headed to work on a construction job, but was first going to stop at Dunkin' Donuts. While at a stop sign, 2 shooters approached the Jeep and fired 9 times. Billy was hit by 3 of those bullets, one of which went through his heart. Billy Veasey died an hour later in the hospital. At the courthouse, FBI agents and the AUSA broke the news to John Veasey, who collapsed on the floor crying for his brother. Initially, the FBI thought Stanford ordered the murder as a warning to Veasey not to testify. But according to Ralph Natali, the hit came from the Molino faction, revenge for the death of Michael Ciancaglini. As Natali put it, a brother for a brother. Let me quickly mention the super thanks icon found beneath this video in the 3-dot dropdown for anyone who wants to show appreciation for videos like this. If it's in fact true that they did kill him, it's very sad because Billy Veasey considered Molino to be a good friend of his, and throughout the years defended Molino and those guys to his brother. John Veasey did wind up testifying and was not only a very effective witness, but a damaging one as well. Stanford was convicted and received 5 consecutive life terms. Frank Martins got 4 life terms, and Vincent Pagano was sentenced to 80 years. John Veasey would wind up serving 10 years and 11 months before he was released. Presently, he's very successful in the car business. He started out as a salesman and now owns several dealerships. There's a certain podcast that boasts Rat of the Month, and they've spoken about numerous cooperators, as it brings views by people who thrive on negative talk. Nevertheless, the one name that has never been mentioned is John Veasey. One would think, if you're going to speak about, or rather bash cooperators, why not bash a guy from your hometown of South Philly? John Veasey's known as a hothead, one with a score to settle, and mentioning his name might just set him off, which could very well result in more than just a pain in the ass next time.